Sociology and women's studies professor Gail Dines presents her research on pornography's social, cultural, and economic impact in America. Politics and Prose Bookstore in Washington, D.C. hosts this half-hour talk.
These things are never built for 5-foot women, you know. So first of all, thank you everyone for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really thrilled that you came. So I want to start with where I was 2 years ago. I was in this huge hall and I was surrounded by pornography, hardcore pornography. And you could barely hear yourself think because of the fake orgasm sounds coming from the pornography. And I'm standing there thinking, how did a nice Jewish girl from Manchester, England get here? And that's the question that many people ask me. How did you end up doing what you do? And if somebody would have told me I was going to be the expert on pornography, right, I didn't think I was going to go there. So let me tell you what happened. I was living in Israel at the time and I was working at the Rape Crisis Centre. I was 22 years old and writing a dissertation for my doctorate. And somebody came up to me and said to me, there's an anti-porn feminist slideshow. Do you want to come? And I'd never really thought about pornography before, and I was 22, what did I know? So I said, okay. Little did I know that night it was going to completely change my life. I couldn't believe the images I was seeing. I literally couldn't believe them. And not only could I not believe that men made these images, I couldn't believe that other men found them arousing. And it was such a shock to me. And I know I talked about misogyny and woman hating, but there's nothing like actually seeing those images up there to deliver the message to you. So that night I went home, I called my advisor and I changed my doctorate topic. And I actually did the doctorate on sociology of media with the special case of pornography. And from that day on, this has tethered me. I'm not going anywhere with this. As long as there's a porn industry, I'm going to be here. So let me tell you about what happened in Israel. An incredible thing happened to me. I'd gone there believing in Zionism and thinking this was a homeland for Jews. And then I got to have to basically counsel Jewish women who'd been raped by Jewish men. I also had to counsel Jewish women who'd been battered by Jewish men and Jewish girls who'd been raped by their fathers. And I began to think, is this really a homeland for Jewish women? Because the same violence against women that goes on in other places goes on here. And then it kind of all coalesced one day. I'm walking down the main street in Tel Aviv, and there's a big porn image flapping in the wind, and it's a woman on her knees giving a man oral sex with Hebrew everywhere. And I thought, the last time a Jewish woman was shown publicly on her knees like that was probably in Nazi Germany, where they made pornographic images of Jewish women. And I went up to the guy and I said to him, there's a law against this, and I'm now going to go to the police and I'm going to get you arrested. Of course, there was no law, right? So they just said that in the hope I'd get him to take it down. And he looks at me, this man. Now, this is a man who's never done women's studies, hasn't got a PhD in media, and he looks at me and he says to me, I know why you don't like that picture. He said, that's you, isn't it? That's you up there. And I thought, yes, you are absolutely right. Of course it's me. As a woman, of course it's me, because that's the reality of pornography. We're all up there, vulnerable and into pornographic gaze. So I went home and I started doing a sociology of media doctorate. And I approached pornography as one would approach any form of media, which is that, how do media images affect us? How do they impact on the world that we live in? And of course, anyone who's progressive politically talks about the role of the media in an unequal society, how the fact that a few have access to most of the resources, and how do we legitimize that? How do we normalize that through a media? And so what I began to realise when I was reading media studies was, if people say images have an effect, if people say they construct reality, then surely pornography is going to do the same thing. Surely pornography is going to construct the reality of men. Because how can you walk away from these images unchanged? And as I always say, pornography delivers patriarchal ideology to men via the penis, which is an extremely successful delivery system. So what I'm looking at here is how images shape the reality. And I'm going to take you through when I was at in Las Vegas at the Adult Video News Awards. And they have a big expo there, and thousands of fans, porn fans, descend on that place. And there was thousands of fans and me. So I'm walking around there, and at first I stop and interview some of the porn producers. And one man talks to me and tells me how he's doing something different. He's not making pornography, his stuff is different. And I look behind me, and he's got a picture, basically an image of a woman kneeling in a coffin as she's being anally penetrated. And I said, the coffin? And he said, well, maybe the coffin's not so good. And so when we walked around and round, and I talked to these people, what I got was the same message over and over again, that they do not know where this industry is going. They do not know how they got to do what they do. They are absolutely amazed that there has been no law or very few lawsuits against them. And they can't believe they're making this amount of money. And I was walking around there looking at all of this pornography and, exhausted and demoralized. And I sat down next to an African American woman who was doing security, the security guard. And I started to talk to her and she wouldn't talk to me. And she thought I was a pornographer, and she was having nothing to do with the pornographers. So I had to tell her, no, I'm not a pornographer, I'm actually a feminist, anti-pornography, I'm writing a book. And eventually she opened up to me, and she told me, she said, I have never seen pornography before. Nobody told me I was going to have this as my detail. And I have got a cring in my neck because I am looking down and cannot stand to look at the pornography. And I looked around, and indeed, most of the security guards were African American women. And then she says to me, I've been divorced 2 years and I can't find a good man. And now I understand why. I never knew it before. And then just as she says that, an African-American woman walks by, one of the women from the pornography industry. And she's dressed in the usual garb, which means not very much. And Patricia, the African-American woman, I call her Patricia, she taps me on the shoulder and she says, go and tell her it's not good for her. Go and tell her this isn't right. And as she does that, a fan comes up to the African-American porn performer and puts his hand on her crotch. She smiles. Everyone takes a picture. And Patricia just groans. And there she was, plotting her exit as far away from Las Vegas as possible. So when I got home and tried to make sense of this, I began to go through some of my notes. And, some of it is actually quite humorous, although it's not really funny. For example, I went up to a store where they have what's called real dolls. Anyone heard of real dolls? These are these anatomically correct dolls, which are worth thousands of dollars. I think there's a 6-month waiting list. I know there's a waiting list. You can choose exactly what size breasts, what colour pubic hair, what lipstick. You get to choose all of that. And I went up to the guy who was behind the desk there, and I said, I'm interviewing people, I'm a journalist, I'm writing a book. And I said, so why do men buy these dolls? He said, well, you know what? He said, they really help men develop relationships with women. So this is what he's telling me. And then he says, but you know what? He says, a lot of women also buy them for their husbands. And I said, so why do you think that is? He says, because these women want lesbian experiences. Yes, this is a lesbian experience with a doll, right? And then what he said to me, which is so interesting, because this tells you something about the industry. I said to him, did you actually see Lars and the Real Girl? Has anyone seen that movie? And he said, not only did I see it, he said, we consulted for it. He said, and the day it came out, our website crashed. That's how popular it was. So you can see the meshing of the industry with mainstream pop culture. So what I'm going to do is give you sort of a brief introduction to my book and show you what I actually wrote about. And I start by walking people through the porn industry. And I do that for a very specific reason. Because many women, especially, and older men, they can't understand why I'm so upset by just a collection of pictures of women in a cornfield smiling with no clothes on. Well, of course, that's not what pornography is today, but that's the image that a lot of people have. So what I have to say is I'm upset because pornography today looks nothing like that. And that was bad enough in its sexism and objectification, but we have now taken it to a completely different level. So what I do is I explain the acts in pornography, I go through the different sites, and I talk about the body-punishing sex, the cruelty, the violence, the degradation, the debasement. I talk about some of the sex acts, and I'll give you an example of the debasement. One's called ATM, ass to mouth, where the man takes his penis and puts it in a woman's anus and then immediately into her mouth without washing. Now, what sexual arousal is there outside of the debasement of the woman? Because how can you think of what's more sexually aroused than that? So what I look at is how pornography, how the sizzle in pornography, how what makes it hot is in fact the debasement of women. So I go through the different sites and I walk people through. And my question is, what effect is this going to have on society? Because the first age of downloading downloading pornography for children is 11 years old. So think about this: 11-year-old boys, the first entree into sex is pornography. And it's not your father's Playboy. It's that hardcore body punishing sex. So the question is, what effect is this going to have on young boys whose sexuality is still developing, who don't even own their sexuality yet, and before they own it, they give it to the pornographers? And so think about, we're in a new world here, because it used to be that generations of boys would grow up, they would be, have hormones raging, they'd go and find their father's Playboy, and they'd have limited access to the Playboy. Today, it's anonymous, it's affordable, and it's accessible 24 hours a day. And so what we're talking about is bringing up a generation of boys on images that we have never before brought them up on. Now, people say, what's going to be the effect of this? Well, we don't know, because we're in the middle of a social experiment. And it's an experiment I bet that most of you never signed on to. But we're going to have to wait and see. But I can begin to tell you what some of the effect is, given the men I've interviewed, which is in the book. The interviews, I really talk to men and ask them about their pornography use. And I do it kind of open-ended so that they get to talk rather than me directing them what they should be talking about. And a lot of them now are very interesting, because I've been doing this for over 20 years. And I used to get an incredible amount of anger and defensiveness, and they would fight with me. And now I don't see that. And what's really strange is how they have actually stopped being defensive and angry, and now they feel anxious about their pornography use. They feel there's something not right in it. And I'll give you an example. I gave a lecture in a huge hall in a northeastern university, and a woman stands up and says, why are men using pornography? What's wrong with them? Why do they do it? And I said, well, rather than ask me, let's turn to the men in the room and talk to them. And one guy gets up and he said, I feel like I'm going to faint. I'm so anxious, but I have to tell you my story. And then he tells a heartbreaking story of his habitual use to pornography. And then he sits down, and then other men start standing up, telling their stories. And I get this now over and over again, of men who thought they could go to pornography, thought that when it's done, they zip up their pants, they zip up their head, and it's all over. No, those images leak into the real world. And what they tell me is, first of all, that the more pornography they use, the more they expect their sex in their real lives to look like the pornography. And they get a shock, because it's not like that. Because pornography is what I call industrial strength sex. And most women will not do that. They will simply not allow the men to do those acts to them. So these men get very upset, they get very angry, they don't understand why they've seen thousands of women do these things, why won't this one lying next to him do it? Also, what they find is that a lot of them lose interest in sex. It looks boring and banal. And what they do is they prefer their pornography to sex with another human being. And I've just interviewed a woman whose husband is in his 20s, she's in her 20s, not had sex for months. Why? He's addicted to pornography. And this is one of the results that happen. Another thing that happens is men find that they cannot ejaculate without pulling up images of their favourite porn star. And they feel bad about this, because they want to be present during sex. They don't want to be thinking of the pornography. Or they have to pull up their favourite scenes. So this is having a really big effect on the young men. Now, what about the women? Well, a lot of the women I interview talk about being pressured into porn sex by their boyfriends and by their hookups. Because I don't know if most of you know what's going on in college campuses today, but there's very little dating and there's lots of hookup sex, which are actually, hookup sex is porn sex. It's sex with no intimacy, it's sex with no connection, it's sex with no empathy. So what you have is really hookup sex being porn sex, which is being played out on all the campuses. Studies show, by the way, that the more hookup sex girls get involved in and young women, the more they're depressed, the lower their self-esteem. What studies show for boys is the more hookup sex they do, the higher their self-esteem. So you can see who this is working for, right? Not to mention, of course, that women get much fewer orgasms during hookup sex. Surprise, surprise, okay? So what happens, the young women tell me, is they feel pressured to do these things and they don't want to do them, and yet they're being told from Cosmopolitan, they're being told from Sex and the City, everywhere they go they're getting the message that pornography is okay, lighten up, it's fun, don't be a prude. And so they have got no alternative ideology with which to come at these men and to say no and to explain why they're not. So another thing that the women tell me, which is very interesting, is how they feel like from the word go, living in a hypersexualized society, they have felt that they have to become sexual beings very early on. Because as they wander around the culture looking for images of themselves, of femininity and what it means to be a woman, the only image they get is this hypersexualized image, and we all know what it looks like,